Some video games just shouldn't have been released in the condition that they were, and honestly, some of them perhaps just shouldn't have been released at all. Granted, some of these games got better over time, but they were notorious for the state they were actually launched in. So in this one, here's a list of the worst video game releases of all time, and make sure to drop a like and subscribe down below if you do want to support the channel. So let's jump in with No Man's Sky. First announced in 2013 as a space exploration game that featured over 18 quintillion planets in its virtual universe, each with their own set of flora, fauna, and all of this is formed in-game through a procedural generation system. The game was developed by a small team from Hello Games and quickly gained some significant attention and media hype across gaming media due to its expansive goals, which was boosted even further when Sony announced that it would help them publish the game for PlayStation 4 alongside the Microsoft Windows version. Sean Murray, co-founder of Hello Games and lead developer for No Man's Sky, gave numerous interviews over the following years during development, explaining features they had planned for the game, including multiplayer. But just prior to No Man's Sky's August 2016 release, early released copies revealed some of the expected gameplay features did not appear present in the game and were still missing following a day one patch. Specifically, there appeared to be no multiplayer, and other features that were demonstrated not only in promotional videos but also that were explained in Murray's interviews were absent from the game. On top of this, players found that the game lacked quality due to the procedural generation, and everything was just kind of samey within the game. It didn't also help that the gameplay elements necessary to explore were quite tedious. Though Murray had tried to set expectations prior to release, the game received a wide range of reviews and generally were negative, especially from players. Negative player reception was compounded by the apparent lack of communication from Hello Games towards these issues, with the team only reporting on bug fixes and performance updates that they released. Murray actually admitted later on that their initial silence post-release had come about due to dramatically underestimating the player size they had to support at the start of the launch of the game. And within these updates, it includes most of the missing features, including multiplayer modes, as well as other significant add-ons which have been met with praise, bringing the game up to and beyond the state expected prior to the launch. By the time of its 5-year anniversary, No Man's Sky's user Steam reviews on Steam had swung to mostly positive after initially starting at overwhelmingly negative at the time of its release. The game is considered a key reminder of what to avoid in marketing a game, with many commenters discussing the proper means to generate interest in the game in a post-No Man's Sky world. And next up is Fallout 76, developed by Bethesda Game Studios. Fallout 76 represented the studio's first foray for a fully online game, as well as the first time multiplayer was included in a Fallout game that's developed by Bethesda. Fallout 76's initial Metacritic score across PC, PS4, and Xbox One platforms had an average of 51 out of 100, with user reviews being even more critical of the game. The game shipped with a large number of bugs and glitches, and Bethesda's early patches to fix those were large and at times reintroduced bugs that had previously been fixed in other patches. Other complaints from players focused on the expensive pricing of in-game cosmetics, as well as introducing items that gave gameplay advantages which could simply be bought with real money. Additionally, there was criticism for Bethesda's attitudes towards the players using mods, regardless of whether their intentions were harmful or not, as well as the game's lack of sufficient anti-cheat protection due to large-scale examples of hacking. Like No Man's Sky, Bethesda had not been great with communication following the release of the game, especially to the community of players, and this led to even further concern from within the player base. In October of 2019, they made a choice to include a premium subscription service that was met with criticism as players had expected some of the exclusive features to have been provided for free. The service was also hampered by bugs upon release, including one that deleted all items from the scrap box, and on top of this, several of the game's physical premium content, such as the collector's edition canvas bag, did not match the original product description or images and was shipped to customers in a state that didn't match the actual promotional material for these items. On top of this, thousands of the Fallout themed helmets were recalled due to containing dangerous levels of mold. By 2022, Bethesda's work to improve the game had garnered some more positive praise from its users, and on its initial release to Steam in April of that year, its users worked to fight a review bomb by posting positive reviews and experiences of the game since release. Overall, Fallout 76 is definitely a story to be wary of for any future video game developers looking to implement a large number of online features, as well as having a somewhat ambitious scope compared to their previous games. And next is Cyberpunk 2077, an action role-playing game that was developed by CD Projekt Red and was based on the Cyberpunk tabletop role-playing game. The game was first announced to be in development in 2012, and following a major showcase for the game in E3 of 2019, it won many awards prior to release, and at the presentation the game was scheduled for release in April of 2022. Critic scores were actually favourable upon release based on the Windows version, but it later came out that the console versions were withheld from the journalists. In response to this, from CD Projekt's CEO Marcin, there was an apology, and they explained that they had hoped been able to fix them ahead of the game's launch. 12 days after release, the Metacritic score for the game on the Windows version was 86 out of 100, while on the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One versions were 55 and 54 respectively. Numerous glitches and game-breaking software bugs were documented, and players began asking for refunds for the game through retailers and digital storefronts. Both Sony and Microsoft eventually agreed to allow these refunds, and after discussions with CD Projekt, Sony had actually recalled Cyberpunk 2077 from their online store for about 6 months while they worked to remove bugs and improve performance to match Sony's standards, with the game then returning to sale in June of 2021. According to CD Projekt developers, management was aware that the game was not ready for release but refused to listen to their warnings. The game's launch has been described as a shambles, and the company's stock actually fell by 9.4%. CD Projekt had also been subject to a lawsuit for fraudulent claims made to investors that related to the state of the game. They had also later released that they had underestimated the task of making a game that was optimized for PC to actually work well on older gen consoles, and their testing had not revealed the problems that players had seen on release. As CD Projekt had began to release major patches for the game in March of 2021, the company stated that in future games they will avoid announcing any titles until they are much closer to a launch state. And this is definitely a good lesson to be learned by any video game developer. And next is Final Fantasy XIV, a massively multiplayer online role-playing game in Square Enix's Final Fantasy series, developed as a spiritual successor to Final Fantasy XI, which was also an MMORPG. The game was released for Microsoft Windows on September 30th of 2010, with plans for a PlayStation 3 port. However, the initial release of the game was met with poor reviews, with critics describing grind-heavy mechanics, poor controls, and a confusing user interface. The Metacritic score of the game in its initial base version is still only 49 out of 100. According to Yoshida, who took on overseeing the game's remake, the original version of Final Fantasy XIV suffered in production as there had been too much focus on the graphics quality and little understanding of fundamentals that make a good MMORPG, with the expectation that problems could always be fixed with updates and patches later on. Shortly after the release, the then CEO of Square Enix issued an official apology for the quality of the game at the 2011 Tokyo Game Show, saying that the Final Fantasy brand had been greatly damaged. The PlayStation 3 port was then cancelled, and Square Enix eventually shut off the game's servers, and redevelopment for the game from scratch into Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn had begun. Yoshida stated that they felt it was necessary to rebuild the game from the ground up to regain the trust they had lost from the fans, and it was not strictly a business decision. The new version was released in August of 2013 and was received much more positively, with an 83 out of 100 Metacritic score for the PC version. Overall, they have managed to pretty much turn their game around at this point, and they are continuing to support it with new expansions and content for players. And next is Battlefield 2042, a first-person shooter game developed by DICE and published by Electronic Arts. It's the 12th main installment of the Battlefield series and was released on November 19th of 2021 for Microsoft Windows, PS4, PS5, Xbox One, and Xbox Series X and S. Its initial impressions were positive since its announcement in June 9th of 2021, and anticipation was really high to the point that the player count for previous Battlefield titles even jumped. However, opinions began to sour over the coming months when DICE announced multiple changes from the standard Battlefield formula, including the removal of the single-player campaign and replacing the series' staple class system with a specialist system more akin to currently existing games. Player concerns continued to mount when the open beta began on October 6th of 2021, citing multiple bugs, glitches, and connectivity issues. Player feedback resulted in the game being delayed from its initial October 22nd launch date to November 19th. The game received negative reviews from players at launch, and it soon became one of the worst reviewed games on Steam, garnering almost 30,000 negative reviews by November of 2021. Players criticized the extensive bugs, the lack of features previously included in older Battlefield games, and several changes to the gameplay. Players also panned the inclusion of a Christmas-themed skin, including a leaked Santa Claus as an example, as this did conflict with the series' dark and gritty tone. The player count, while initially high, quickly dropped to the point that player population of previous titles actually overtook it on February 14th of 2022. The current plans for Battlefield 2042 is that they are committing to making it better and actually reworking a lot of the systems that were in the launch version of the game. So we'll have to wait and see as these things come out how Battlefield 2042 could potentially turn itself around. Next up is Aliens Colonial Marines. This is a first-person shooter game that was developed by Gearbox Software and is set in the universe of the Alien franchise. It was criticized at launch for containing bugs and poorly implemented AI, unbalanced gameplay, low-quality graphics, and a poorly implemented co-op mode. A couple of the issues have since been adjusted or fixed to a certain degree, and the game's story also drew criticism for its lack of consistency and continuity with the Alien films, despite claims from the developers that the events of the game were supposed to be canon to the film series. Particular criticism was directed towards discrepancies in the game's quality between pre-release builds demonstrated at events and that of the game in its promotional materials. The differences were essentially lower quality graphics, missing levels, and more. Shortly after the game's release, the discovery of these regressions from the promotional material were acknowledged, and the studio stated that they would look into them. In July of 2018, a mod developer reviewing the game's code found that a typo in the configuration files resulted in the poor artificial intelligence shown by the game's enemies that was observed in its original release state. Manually correcting the error led to the enemies having more consistent behavior with press material, as well as the aliens from the film franchise. And next is Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5, which was a revival of the Tony Hawk's franchise. The game was panned for its poor quality, especially in comparison to its predecessors, with reviews citing various performance issues, environmental clipping, and in-game physics issues. The game's environments were critiqued for their poor aesthetic, unmemorable level themes, small size, dull challenging tasks, lack of NPCs, and for not containing as many hidden secrets as was in the previous Tony Hawk games. Before the game was released, the licensing deal between Activision and Tony Hawk was set to expire, and as a result the game was hastily developed within a few months and released in an unfinished state with little promotion. The nature of the game's online modes were criticized for providing little incentive to players and exacerbated the game's performance issues. Next up is Duke Nukem Forever. This is cited as one of the worst video games of all time, mainly attributed to its extremely long development cycle. The Escapist, in their 2016 list of 8 worst video games of all time, called the game an example of what happens when hype is far greater than the quality of the game. In a retrospective, Destructoid stated that reactions at the time ranged from negative to, "I guess it could have been worse." Screen Rant also explained that the negative reaction to the game was a result of how long it took to come out, rather than any specific aspect of the actual final game. So this is a really good example of hyping up a game with a long development time and then not meeting user expectations. And next up is Superman 64. The controls were panned for being confusing and difficult, commands for various actions were reported to either be unresponsive or not working consistently, such as flying, landing, and even picking up objects. Tim Weaver of N64 magazine complained that the only way to stop flying is to crash into a solid object, preferably a wall, and that you always have to press forward to go forward, even if you're facing to the camera. Other technical problems were reported to be commonplace, such as bugs, unfavorable camera angles, bad enemy AI, broken frame rates, clipping environments and objects, and poor collision detection. The graphics were condemned as basic and poor for the Nintendo 64's game release in 1999. The most frequent criticism was the excessive distance fog, and Mega Man Fun claimed it was an excuse for the developers to not take full advantage of the Nintendo 64 console, and Hugh Norton-Smith of Hyper wrote that the fog would actually force players to preempt approach buildings in order not to hit them. The textures were criticized as near non-existent and too repetitive, flat and featureless for a virtual world setting. Reviews also panned the character animations, such as the animations where Superman is punching and flying. Total N64 critic Lee described the intro cinematic as like a scene from C64 game in 1985, and stated the sharp edges of the polygons gave Superman pixel boots. On top of this, the audio of the game was also criticised. The repetitiveness of the soundtrack was brought up by reviewers such as GameSpot's Joe, who felt it would be considered bad for the SNES. He also noted the sparse voice work even changes at one point from Man of Steel actors to someone who sounds nothing like the lead of the show. Overall, pretty much all aspects of the game were pretty much poorly received and frowned upon, so this was just an overall disaster of a game launch. And next up is both of these Zelda CDI games, Link the Faces of Evil and Zelda the Wand of Gamelon. These are two action-adventure video games that were developed by Animation Magic and published by Philips Interactive Media. The two games were released on the same day and were developed simultaneously and look and play very similarly because they use the same graphics engine. Both games are based on Nintendo's The Legend of Zelda franchise, but are not considered official entries into the game series, and are the first two games of 3 Zelda titles released for the CDI. At the time of their release, the games received mixed to positive reviews, and both games, alongside Zelda's Adventure and Hotel Mario, have become infamous with modern critics, which has led to the 3 games being considered not only the worst games in the Zelda franchise, but also amongst the worst video games of all time. Wired magazine has said that the animations in both games was extremely simple and stilted, and that the graphics had several glitches in it. The designers were criticised by IGN's Travis for the game's insufferable controls and for the designer's poor understanding of the Legend of Zelda franchise. He noted, however, that the backgrounds looked decent considering the poor design for the CDI's hardware, and on top of this, the game's animated cutscenes and voice actings drew particular criticism, in some cases being described as laughable and cheesy, and in other cases being described as jarring. Other reviewers also described them as freakish and an absolute joke. The game's soundtrack also drew mixed responses, with Zelda Elements saying it felt average and not up to the usual Zelda quality, while IGN described the soundtrack as Red Book Audio CD pop. However, this has been contested by other reviewers who described it as diverse, high quality, and superb, with an adventurous, upbeat tempo, blending delicious 80s synth, electric guitar, panpipes, marimbas, and other unusual instruments. But next we have to talk about E.T. for the Atari 2600. It's based on Steven Spielberg's 1982 film of the same name, E.T. Apparently it was coded in just 5 weeks to be released in time for the 1982 holiday season. The game sold around 1.5 million copies and came nowhere near the Atari's expectations of 5 million units. A large number of the cartridges sold were sent back to the company because many customers found the game to be unenjoyable. Truckloads of these cartridges were buried in a landfill in New Mexico after they failed to sell. E.T. is commonly cited as the catalyst for a crash of the video game industry in 1983, as Atari had hoped that brand loyalty would keep customers buying their games regardless of the quality. E.T. was listed as the worst game of all time by PC World in 2006. It was also ranked as the second worst game of all time by Game Trailers, and first place won out to Superman 64 that's previously on this list. Some consider it so bad that the title screen was the only good part of the game. Since the mass burial of many unsold cartridges of the E.T. game, the event has become a cultural icon and a reminder of the video game crash of 1983. It was the end result of a disastrous fiscal year for Atari and was sold off by its parent company Warner Communications. Though it was believed that millions of copies of E.T. were buried, Atari officials later verified that the numbers were actually around 700,000 cartridges of various games that did include E.T. If you've enjoyed watching this list, make sure to click like down below to support the channel and subscribe for the other videos that we already have for you guys on the channel, such as our list on cancelled video games that you will never get to play that you should definitely check out if you haven't already, or take a look on the channel for the other videos that we already have out there, and some of them might just be perfect